Great, good afternoon. Hello, and welcome to our webinar introducing the California Community Wildfire Protection Plan Toolkit. We are glad to have you here today and look forward to sharing information and taking questions. My name is Annie Leverich, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. I'm the Communications Manager for the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, and I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area. So first, we'll go through our agenda for today's call. We'll kick things off with some housekeeping notes for our Zoom webinar. We'll then jump into an overview of Community Wildfire Protection Plans, or CWPPs. Next, we'll do an introduction of the California CWPP Toolkit, which will be the bulk of today's call. And after introducing the toolkit and some of its key elements, we'll have a question and answer session with our presenters. Then we'll wrap up with information on how to follow up with any remaining questions. So before we dive into today's content, let's go over some quick housekeeping items to ensure a smooth experience for everyone. First, please note that this webinar is being recorded. We will make this video available after the meeting. So if you miss anything or you want to review the material, you'll be able to access it later. Next, this live webinar does feature Spanish language interpretation. You have the option to listen to the Spanish version live by selecting the interpreter button on the bottom of your screen. Live closed captioning in English is also available during this webinar by clicking the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. So next, we want to hear your questions. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during the presentation. We will address as many as we can during the designated Q&A session toward the end of the webinar. Our webinar is scheduled to run for 1 hour, including a Q&A session at the end. We'll do our best to stay on track and ensure that you leave with helpful information and ways to follow up. And last, presenters and panelists will be introduced as we move through the content and will be available during the Q&A session. So I'd like to now pass things off to Chief Chris Ramey from CAL FIRE for the webinar. Welcome.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chris Ramey. I'm Assistant Chief of Pre-Fire Planning within the Office of the State Fire Marshal's Community Wildfire Preparedness and Mitigation Division, and I'll be one of your panelists for this session. We're happy to have you join us as we discuss this new tool. The rollout today marks an important milestone in empowering communities to take proactive steps toward wildfire resilience. You'll see there on the screen, there's another name, Chief Emily Smith. She's Staff Chief of Wildfire Planning and Statistics. She is my boss. She oversees our pre-fire planning program, our wildland fuels reduction reporting program, and our California Incident Data and Statistics program. And I specifically work in the pre-fire planning program. If you take a look at the screen, you'll see some logos at the bottom of the slide. They represent the hardworking team behind this project. This toolkit was developed through a collaborative effort involving the OSFM Pre-Fire Planning Program, the Community Wildfire Planning Center, the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, and the California Fire Safe Council. Each group's expertise and dedication have been instrumental in bringing this resource to life. This project was made possible through grant funding from CAL FIRE, supported by the California Climate Investments Program. This program is a statewide initiative that uses cap and trade dollars to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, strengthen communities, and improve public health and the environment, particularly in communities most affected by climate change. So we'll transition to the next slide, and we're excited to share this valuable resource with you today. So we're going to discuss we're going to give you a quick overview of the community wildfire protection plans. Some of you may be very familiar with CWPPs, their development and use, and some may not. So what is a community wildfire protection plan, or CWPP? It is a focused plan designed to address wildfire risk and improve community resilience. These plans must be developed collaboratively, bringing together local governments, fire departments, fire safe councils, community members, and many others to create actionable strategies that reduce wildfire hazards. These plans play an important role in coordinating efforts, setting priorities, tracking progress on implementation of mitigation projects, and securing funding. They also complement other planning documents, such as local hazard mitigation plans, unit fire plans, and general plan safety elements by providing additional data or helping to align shared goals. In some cases, communities, contract counties, or CAL FIRE units have streamlined efforts by combining their CWPPs with unit fire plans, creating a single comprehensive document. By developing or updating CWPPs, communities can take meaningful steps toward reducing wildfire risk and protecting lives, property, and natural resources. So, what's the purpose of the CWPP toolkit, and how can you leverage it for success? Over the past 20 years, CWPPs have evolved. While many of today's plans address a wide range of topics and serve multiple goals for communities, not all of them include the critical elements necessary for long-term success. Or some folks aren't even sure what they should include to produce an effective CWPP. So we wanted to help. The California CWPP Toolkit was created to address potential gaps of information, help improve the overall effectiveness of CWPPs, and give groups developing or updating a CWPP a jumping off point. It aims to create more consistency across CWPPs, ensuring they meet a minimum standard of quality, clarify expectations from CAL FIRE, the state agency responsible for forest management, empower communities to take ownership of their wildfire risk by providing the tools they need to develop their own plans, and offer additional support to communities navigating the CWPP process. Additionally, this toolkit also aligns with California's broader wildfire resilience strategy. Specifically, it fulfills one of the fire-adapted communities actions outlined in California's Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan from 2021, furthering statewide efforts to reduce wildfire risks and enhance community preparedness. With this toolkit, communities now have a comprehensive resource to guide them in developing effective, actionable CWPPs. Let's take a closer look at how it was developed. I'll hand it off to Molly Mowry, one of the toolkit team members from the Community Wildfire Planning Center, who co-led the development of the toolkit.
Great, thanks, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, our organization, the Community Wildfire Planning Center, worked closely with CAL FIRE and the rest of our team to develop the toolkit. And although the toolkit officially launched in November of 2024, the development process took a little bit more than 2 years. So behind the scenes, we were actively developing, and during that time, we conducted a statewide survey and virtual listening sessions, which some of you may have participated in. So we're really grateful for your input during that initial process. We also had additional input from the county coordinators, which was hosted by the California Fire Safe Council to gather their input on resources and information. So again, thanks so much for anyone's time that participated in that. We spent a lot of time researching and interviewing communities across California who have been working on CWPPs, and we'll speak a little bit more about that in the best practices. We looked at what other states and even some provinces are doing across the US and Canada in terms of what does their guidance and minimum requirements look like for CWPPs. We reviewed and researched, or we reviewed research and literature on what makes CWPPs effective, so how we can improve outcomes through the guidance that we were developing. And then we finally worked collaboratively as a team and especially closely with our CAL FIRE team members to develop the materials and ensure their input was really baked into this process along the entire way. So the toolkit went live this fall, as we said, and now it's hosted on the CAL FIRE's Office of the State Fire Marshal's Community Wildfire Preparedness and Mitigation website. And this is just a reference to the full link in case you haven't seen the toolkit yet. I'll go next in just framing the major components of the toolkit and then hand it back off to Chris and Kelly. So when you arrive at the website, there's three primary components to the toolkit. The first one is the CWPP guide, which is a comprehensive downloadable guide you'll hear more about, but just want to point out this is really the best starting point for anyone wanting to familiarize yourself more with the toolkit and for reviewing those different minimum requirements, which we'll get into in a moment. There's also a set of downloadable CWPP best practices, as well as a set of different CWPP resources to support overall development and implementation. So we'll go through each of these in more detail. I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Kelly Johnston, who's also with the Community Wildfire Planning Center.
Thank you, Molly. So the CWPP guide establishes the minimum requirements for both the CWPP planning process and the required content in the final plan. The California CWPP requirements are based on the Healthy Forest Restoration Act from 2003, which was the original legislation that first introduced what CWPPs are. Additional requirements were also developed by CAL FIRE. The purpose for having these minimum requirements is to ensure every CWPP provides a minimum level of information and aligns with the expectations of CAL FIRE on CWPPs, who is the state forestry agency that approves the final CWPPs. The guide also contains additional guidance on many different topics that are important to understanding and developing CWPPs. Some of these include project scoping, data and resources for planning area, working groups, stakeholders, when to update a CWPP, and other topics, which we'll also get into as we move on. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the minimum requirements. So the Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003 was the first official federal legislation to describe CWPPs and establish a minimum set of general requirements for the CWPPs for it to be considered valid. The three minimum requirements are, first of all, a CWPP must be collaboratively developed. Secondly, a CWPP must identify and prioritize areas for hazardous fuel reduction treatments on both federal and non-federal land, and a CWPP must recommend measures that homeowners and communities can take to reduce the ignitability of structures. In addition to these three requirements, 3 signatures are required to approve a CWPP. One from the representative of the applicable local government, one from the chief of the local fire department or fire district, and one from the state forester or their designee. In this case, it would be someone from CAL FIRE. Some groups also put into the initial guidance, but CWPPs have evolved to keep pace. But CWPPs have evolved to keep pace with different community wildfire planning needs. For example, CWPPs can be developed and implemented at different scales, including a county, city, town, or district. These scales can sometimes nest with one another, but different scales can also mean that different topics get addressed or sometimes inadvertently get overlooked. As a result, many other states have taken the approach of building a Healthy Forest Restoration Act requirements to ensure, building on the Healthy Forest Restoration Acts to ensure the CWPPs meet the minimum expectations. And we'll dive a little deeper into those with Chris on the next slide.
Thanks, Kelly. Well, to begin, collaboration is a critical step in this process. We want you to form a CWPP working group that includes representatives from local government, the local fire authority, and CAL FIRE, and maybe others. The goal is to ensure that different perspectives are integrated throughout the planning stages. We also emphasize the importance of consultation with relevant federal agencies that pertain to the CWPP planning area. Try to identify and involve local experts and stakeholders, as their insights will help to shape the plan's content and determine priorities that reflect the community's needs. Community outreach and engagement are vital components of the CWPP process. This will provide opportunities for public input, allowing community members to express their concerns and provide feedback regarding the plan's contents and priorities. It is imperative to tailor these engagement activities to the specific context of your planning area and to document all outreach efforts in the final CWPP. After the heavy lift of creating or updating a plan, the guide discusses the review and approval stage. This involves submitting the final CWPP key representatives from local government and fire departments for thorough review and endorsement. Ensuring consensus among all stakeholders before moving forward is crucial. And then plan submission. This requires formally submitting the finalized CWPP to the local CAL FIRE unit chief or contract county chief, as well as to the Office of the State Fire Marshal's Community Wildfire Preparedness and Mitigation Division. Now we can get into what kind of contents we would like to see in a CWPP. First, we want to see a cover page that includes the plan's name and the date of final approval or adoption. You must also include a signature page, which could feature scanned signatures from local representatives, fire chief, or an authorized CAL FIRE representative. This indicates their formal approval of the plan. Next, ensure to articulate the goals and objectives of your CWPP. This section should clearly outline the intended outcomes of the plan, providing a focused direction for its implementation. It's essential to define the roles and responsibilities of the lead agencies and organizations involved in the CWPP creation. Clarity in this area ensures that all parties understand their specific contributions to the plan. Consider applicable plans and regulations. Identifying relevant local, state, and federal guidelines will help inform the content and actionable strategies of your CWPP. We need a clear delineation of the planning area and some information about the communities covered in the planning area. This includes mapping the CWPP boundaries and providing descriptions of population, land ownership, and fire environment. It's recommended that additional information to support informed decision-making be included as well, and Kelly will be going over that soon. You'll also need to identify fire protection areas, recognizing federal responsibility areas, FRA, state responsibility areas, and local responsibility areas, and other fire protection districts is critical to clarifying legal and financial responsibilities related to wildfire prevention and response. We want you to paint a picture of the wildland-urban interface, assess wildfire hazard within the CWPP planning area, identify highly valued resources and assets like structures, critical infrastructure, cultural and natural resources, critical habitat, watersheds, timber, etc. Whatever is important to your community or planning area. An integral part of your CWPP will be the assessment of wildfire hazard and risk. This involves evaluating wildfire hazards present in your planning area and identifying highly valued resources and assets that require protection. The guide provides details on how this can be accomplished. Develop an action plan. The plan should summarize prioritized actions, designate responsible agencies, outline implementation timelines, and establish metrics for tracking progress. Ensure that it includes a minimum set of actions to address fuel treatments and structural ignitability measures. It's important to think about and focus on landscape management and hazardous fuel reduction treatments. Identify and prioritize areas for hazard fuel reduction and recommend the most effective treatment methods that will protect at-risk communities. We want you to identify specific measures that will reduce ignitability for structures and critical infrastructure. This will help communities implement strategies that reduce the ignitability of both new and existing developments, keeping in mind applicable state requirements such as fire safe regulations, defensible space requirements, and building code. The final requirement is to assess wildfire response and suppression capabilities. This involves evaluating the readiness and resources of local fire services, including their Emergency Operations Center capabilities. Keep in mind that these are the minimum requirements we are looking for, but there is other recommended information that may be included. I'll turn it back over to Kelly for more information about our recommended guidance.
Thanks, Chris. So in addition to those requirements, the CWPP guide also provides a lot of additional recommended guidance for the communities. Keep in mind that these are not requirements, but suggestions to assist the communities in development and implementation of their plans. Some of the recommended guidance includes how to form and facilitate a CWPP working group. So the CWPP working group is the core group central to the success of the plan. So it's an important thing. There's guidance in there for that. There's also questions to support the initial scoping process to determine the appropriate type of CWPP contents, detail and schedule, and more. And in addition to that, some guidance on developing hazard and risk assessments, including data sources and simple methodology for those communities that don't have a lot of technical horsepower. And finally, suggestions on the implementation and update process, such as when to consider a major update to a CWP and what factors to base, different factors to base that on. So I'll pass it off to Molly for the next component.
Thanks, Kelly. So I just wanted to preview the set of CWPP best practices on the toolkit webpage. And these are meant to showcase replicable strategies of how to increase your CWPP's impact and improve overall outcomes. So each of the best practices incorporates examples from different California communities to help illustrate, what the theme is and what some strategies and tips are based on real life examples from across the state. So the featured best practices, the topics are aligning your CWPP with other plans for maximum impact, providing county level leadership for CWPP development and implementation, engaging whole communities equitably through public participation, creating diverse and multidisciplinary working groups, and employing robust CWPP project implementation and tracking methods. Many of these best practices also expand on guidance from the guide that Kelly and Chris just highlighted. So we're really trying to help you meet the minimum requirements or recommended guidance by looking at these examples as well. So for example, the CWPP Working Group's best practice complements information discussed in the guide with strategies such as the selection process, identifying a coordinator, developing a work plan. And this best practice incorporates some examples from Mariposa County, Lassen County, Humboldt County, and others. So again, just a big shout out to thank the communities we interviewed and highlighted across the toolkit best practices and the resources. And on that note, I'll turn it back over to Kelly to share a quick overview about the resources.
Thanks, Molly. So in addition to everything that we've already talked about, we have also created some resources as part of the guide. First of all, there's a customizable template to create your own CWPP. This is intended to reduce the workload for, again, the smaller communities or anyone that's not wishing to spend a bunch of time formatting. It's optional, but it is designed to help the communities easily get started and follow the minimum requirements. There's also an in-depth outreach and engagement workbook that describes the different type of engagement levels that communities can undertake, a range of activities and supportive materials, for example, sample meeting agendas. And there is also a resource to help the users think about whether and how to incorporate compliance with CEQA into the process of preparing and improving a CWPP. Next is a resource in guidance and hiring on working with consultants which includes insights on developing a request for proposal. There's resources on potential funding sources, and finally, supplemental resources such as research, videos, etc., to learn more about CWPPs and increase the success of an effective CWP. So on that note, back to you for some more resources, Chris.
Okay. So one of the questions I'm sure a lot of people have is whether or not the new requirements are going to affect any old CWPPs. The answer is no. CWPPs previously adopted prior to the launch of this toolkit are not subject to retroactive review or approval by CAL FIRE. However, communities are encouraged to review their CWPPs to determine if future updates are necessary to ensure compliance with these minimum requirements. The guide specifically points the public and entities to CAL FIRE unit chiefs and contract county chiefs for engagement in CWPP development or updates. If a public request for engagement or support is received, we will, or submitted to us, we will try to get you pointed in the right direction and get you in best contact. Our expectation is that CAL FIRE will support and engage with any kind of CWPP efforts. CAL FIRE is not requiring a minimum time frame for updates. However, included are some factors for consideration to determine when an update may be needed. These factors can include the relevancy of goals and objectives, changes to scale of the planning area, major events such as wildfires or other natural disaster that has altered the wildland fire hazard, changes in the WUI, such as new development, changes or additions to collaborators and partners. Grant funding sources may require, this is a key point, there are some grant funding sources that may require updated CWPPs to qualify for funding, for example, within 5 years or 10 years. Alignment with other plan cycles, such as local hazard mitigation plans or general plan safety elements, or new signatories. At this time, we're not anticipating that the new CAL FIRE CWPP requirements will have any effect on competitiveness of grant applications or CWPP updates or development. But any new CWPP or update will have to take into consideration these new requirements and plan accordingly. I'll turn it back over to Annie.
Hi, thanks, Chris, for passing it back. So we're now going to do some question and answer for the next 20 minutes or so. Thank you so much to our presenters for offering an overview of CWPPs and the California CWPP Toolkit. We will do our best in this question and answer session to answer as many questions as possible, but we may not be able to get to them all. So at the end of the Q&A, we will provide contact information for follow-up questions. And we also know that folks may have submitted questions during the registration process. So if your question hasn't gotten answered today or isn't answered during the Q&A session, we do encourage you to follow up. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can see our panelists. And I'll go ahead and open up the Q&A. So to kick things off, I'll just go ahead and find a good one in here. Thank you, everyone, for asking so many. Deborah Mackey asks, I did not catch all who need to approve the CWPP. What is the timeline for approval?
What we're asking for is that there be a signature from the local CAL FIRE representative or contract county representative that is in charge of forest management for the state. As far as timeline goes, you could have a CWPP that is in progress for years potentially. You could have it come together pretty quick too. It depends on the complexity of the planning area, how many communities are involved, what kind of complexities are related to your specific geographical area, and what kind of issues that people are most concerned about. So there's no real good one answer. It just depends on complexity.
Yeah, and sometimes I would just add that the timeline is really driven by a grant. So if you have constraints for a grant, then obviously that's a consideration in the overall timeline.
Great. See another question here. Has any estimation been done on the hours it will take to complete a CWPP from scratch and what the estimated costs might be for consultants and etc.?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, go for it, Molly.
It really depends so much on the scale, as Chris just said, the level of complexity, whether it's a full-scale update to a previous CWPP, whether it's from scratch or whether it's minor updates. So, I think one of the overriding goals of this entire toolkit was to help communities feel more empowered that they have the guidance to do this. The template, as Kelly mentioned, is meant to be really simple. I know simple is a loose word here, but again, there's so many factors on how much time it takes and how many folks are engaged in terms of whether volunteer or consultant time. Kelly, do you want to just quickly speak to the consultant resource?
Yeah, so we do have a consultant resource in the CWPP toolkit, and it actually offers some good guidance on what components of the CWPP that might require the expert opinion of consultants. So there are many pieces of the CWPP that can be achieved by the community themselves. And that's an opportunity for more engagement with the community, more ownership, and also reduced costs.
Great. This one is from Bob Brown. Basic question, why would I want to complete a CWPP? What are the benefits for being in a community with a CWPP?
You want to go for that one, Molly, or you want me to go to try?
I
There-
can give a couple of points first to start off. The CWPP, I really we really refer to it as the document where the rubber hits the road. You can have a lot of policy documents, general plans, and other components of wildfire resiliency, but the CWPP is your opportunity to pull it all together in one document. In addition to that, there is the completion of CWPPs can often open up doors for other grant funding. I'll pass it off to you, Molly.
Sure, I would just add to that, in our experience of seeing these across California and across really North America, Canada and the US, that it's a great both a product and a process. So oftentimes it is a mechanism for bringing groups together in ways. And Chris spoke to the importance of the collaboration to work through and identify where are your priorities. Because without a plan, you could be rehashing the same discussions every meeting, trying to figure out where you want to prioritize risk. So it's really that risk identification, hazard and risk identification and prioritization tool that can act as that roadmap for where you see and hopefully where you can implement change in your community.
Yep, and I'll just add that, again, community members, this is an opportunity for community members and, other stakeholders that you might not think of, to have a voice and, be able to have their input as to where the priority treatments should be or what the priority issues are regarding failing critical infrastructure or hey, we've got, some really specialized problems here that we can address in this. And we can then use that CWPP to leverage funding, leverage, you know, it's an organized effort in order to do the greatest good in that community or planning area.
Next question is from Irene Damsky. Are all cities required to do them? Are they available for general public review?
No, there's really no requirement to do a CWPP. It, you know, like Kelly was saying back in 2003 with the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, kind of introduced this concept to help communities, essentially prioritize what needs to be done. And there is no requirement for them to be done. But if they are, really what they're providing a way to get these larger projects funded through some grant funding that a lot of which requires prioritized projects be within a collaboratively developed CWPP. So I don't know if you have any more on that.
No, I would just underscore what you said, Chris.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. This next question is from Magdalena Valderrama. Is there a standing list available of what the changes are as, quote, new requirements? What was then and how is it different from now?
Prior to this toolkit, there were really only three requirements of a CWPP. And those were that they were developed collaboratively, set priorities for fuels treatments, and reduce structural ignitability. And now, so over time, that's a pretty low bar to set. And in our experience, as these have been developed across the state, we're trying to implement a minimum set of requirements for the process that needs to be followed and the contents within that CWPP that will provide the greatest good to everyone who is collaborating or being consulted on those plans. It's an opportunity for federal agencies, state agencies, elected officials, community groups, FireWise, FireSafe, communities like, representatives for specific interests to come together and say, hey, this is the direction we need to go. Let's collaborate and all get aligned. So that's what we're attempting to do here is just create a plan that means the most to us as a state agency, managing timber or forest land and have the greatest effect on reducing fire hazard or risk from fire hazard.
And maybe, Chris, we would add that throughout this process, we mentioned we did a pretty thorough review of CWPPs across the state from many different scales, the district scale, city, county, etc. And most CWPPs already meet those minimum requirements. So this wasn't really a big departure from, what we see already out there. It's more that it formalizes it in one place that's easy, especially if you haven't started a CWPP, you kind of know what the expectations are now and have some guidance for that. So again, this really also aligns with the direction many other states have taken to formalize those requirements and make it really clear.
I'm seeing a couple similar questions in the chat asking about how to find these types of CWPPs or other fire plans that address their community.
Yeah, there's a couple ways to go about that. One is talk to your local fire chief Typically, those fire protection districts and or volunteer fire department chiefs or uh, local fire chiefs are going to know whether or not there is a CWPP that covers the area. You can also talk to your local CAL FIRE unit or contract county um, to ask them if they know of any local CWPPs that might cover your community. If you are within the state responsibility area, it's almost assured that your community is covered in some way, either through a unit fire plan, which every CAL FIRE unit produces and every contract county produces. But for more specific local jurisdictions or incorporated cities, you might have to talk to like the planning department or something like that.
Thanks, Chris. The question here from Naseem Rashidi. Do we have minor updates for CW? Can we make minor updates on CWPPs annually or after a fire event, or is it just every 5 years or so?
Yeah, absolutely. We encourage that when there's a change in the community, it's not just a fire event, but it could be that there's some substantial growth in the community or the landscape has changed otherwise. That we encourage that would be reflected in a CWPP update. And sort of the 10-year mark is the kind of maximum recommended time and sometimes tied to funding as well.
Kelly. Seeing kind of some similar questions in the chat around who is responsible for the CWPP.
The CWPP, it depends, as we talked earlier, that could be at different scales. So depending on the scale that the CWPP is applied, whether it's the fire district or the local government, the town or city or county, that's typically dictates who would ultimately be the lead on the project. So someone, for example, a county CWPP, ideally it would be someone from the county that would lead that. It could be a wildfire mitigation specialist within the county. It could be the county fire authority, depending on who is established as the lead.
We also know a lot of fire safe councils have taken a major leadership role in developing these, implementing these, working with CAL FIRE and other partners on these. So I think also looking to if you have a local fire safe council is a great resource or entry point. Annie, there was a question that maybe I thought Chief Vargas could answer, since this has come up in some of our other trainings and discussions, is just why or if CWPPs need to be separate from local hazard mitigation plans or what that relationship is between the two plans.
Yeah, I think so. CWPPs kind of have their specific kind of requirements and things to do, things to accomplish. And so some of those things within the CWPP can be referenced in the local hazard mitigation plan as well as within other planning documents. But it has its specific role and is important in establishing priorities and developing plan and mitigations for that. So yes, it can be incorporated within the local hazard mitigation plan, but it's definitely a vital document to have standalone as well.
Seeing a few questions in the chat related to sort of the boundaries or size of the community that a CWPP might cover. Folks want to comment on that?
Well, it's the area of interest is determined by whoever is developing the CWPP. So typically Again, it typically it extends to the jurisdictional boundaries of that entity. For example, a county would be the county boundaries. Um, there, this is where the whole idea of the nesting, the possibility of nesting comes in, is if there are unique communities within the county, um, then there may be an option to have a community or a number of community CWPPs within that overarching county CWPP.
So this question from Monique Byro, what are some out-of-the-box methods you've seen for successful community engagement with folks who may not have a fire background or don't believe their space is at risk of being impacted by the effects of wildfire?
Oh gosh. Annie, I would say you and some of your colleagues really helped us with the development of the resource related to outreach and engagement with the wide variety of stakeholders and members of the public. So I don't know if you can think of any off the top of your head, but at a minimum, I just want to underscore how useful that resource is for everyone to look at, especially for meeting ideas, engagement ideas, different activities and exercises for, drawing from a large group of people and engaging them in the process.
Yeah, we do have a really great resource about community engagement in the toolkit and, really just trying to tailor some engagement to what your community might be interested in. If it's more online engagement or in person, if it's more in person, food always helps. I'll just say that.
And that was, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Molly.
No, I was just going to say that's a really important point is looking at some of the, maybe different, even practical ways of holding meetings. And this is something we heard from some of the communities we interviewed too, is how to capture um, or have more participants in a meeting when it might be a really busy time of year, or like being sensitive to, is it fire season? And I know we all use that term loosely now. Are there other ways, though, to get folks that maybe aren't always thinking about fire? You said food, but we also heard some people give stipends, or they also think about, like, can you use the stipend for, finding a babysitter, for example, or different languages and holding the meetings in languages that may be more accessible to different audiences. So just those are just a few snippets from some of the tips we got from communities.
Thanks, Molly. This next question is from Jesse Godfrey. Can you give some specific examples of how CWPPs have improved wildfire preparedness across California? For example, of a community following the prioritization laid out in the CWPP and being successful.
Yeah, I'm personally aware of, I spent a lot of time in my career in Humboldt and Del Norte counties, and the Humboldt County CWPP has absolutely provided some really great direction to, as you get community members, there's kind of like a turnover. There might be a community member that's really on top of it. They are fully engaged, and then, they move away, or, they just are getting older and they can't take on that much responsibility anymore. The CWPP, getting that into plan form provides a map, if you will, that has incorporated all of the previous community members, like specific concerns, like, hey, we need to open up, make sure that this evacuation road is maintained, because if we let this close in, then we're going to risk this entire segment of the community. And so it's a place for those ideas and those collaborative, conversations that bring these things to the surface. It's a place for them to get down on paper, have a map, show that, look, this has been a concern in the past. here's our risk assessment, which identifies all of these items. And then it's in, it's a roadmap for the future folks that are get involved. And it makes it easier to get involved because it's like written down, there's like a plan in place. So that's one benefit that I've seen.
Thank you, Chris. See a question here. At a local community level, as opposed to a county level, isn't a FireWise USA risk assessment basically the same thing?
Maybe you can help me with this, Molly, but there's been several questions like this. I've been trying to answer them in the chat as quick as I can. Um, a the CWPP is more in depth and creates there's a lot more information in it, and it creates a better plan. I know Roberta asked this question, and the FireWise risk assessments that you do in your county are are top notch, and they're closer to a CWPP, but a CWPP is more of an official plan that is signed by the cooperating agencies and requires more collaboration. And if you have anything to add to that, Molly.
Well, we did see some overlap when we were looking at some communities that you said, as you just mentioned. I'm not sure which county you're thinking of, but I'm thinking of another one where there was a very similar assessment process, but often, and Shane, I know this is more through your shop, the Firewise program, but often we see, as you said, a little less detail, a little lighter touch on the Firewise approach. And, it's a great way for community members to organize, but it is different than the robust approach that CWPPs, especially the minimum requirements that Chris outlined for meeting, the expectations of what type of information would really be involved in not just the hazard and risk assessment portion, but all of the other content requirements and the priorities.
Thanks, Shane and Molly. Here's a question. Why does the CWPP need approval if it's not required?
Really the signatory page that we want to have our state forest management agency sign is so that CAL FIRE is essentially one, aware that this planning document exists, and two, that they have been involved with helping to align the plan with their current plan. And then, we essentially want to make sure that we know that it was collaboratively developed. We know who was involved, and that the priorities listed are in fact, it's essentially we're providing our CAL FIRE signatories or local fire protection district chiefs or other signatories are essentially endorsing the plan. It's not necessarily an approval. It's like, yeah, we're behind this.
Great. I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. And I am seeing some questions in the chat about some broken links in the CWPP guide PDF, and so we will be addressing those for sure. See. Okay, I see a question. What are some of the common missteps of CWPPs?
Molly, I don't know if with all the research you did, you might be able to identify something.
Yes, I think one that comes to mind is really neglecting the public outreach and engagement process and kind of overlooking that. I know sometimes it's a challenge as well, which is again why we made so much or put so much effort into a pretty large resource on outreach and engagement, because sometimes people say, well, we made the best effort, but no one showed up to the meeting. So, or no one replied to the survey. So also in our best practices, we feature communities that, took some time to really think through how they could better engage folks going to farmers markets or setting up booths and, kind of thinking outside the box. One of the missteps too, I'd say, is I think sometimes, and again, this is why we made the hiring a consultant resource readily available, is, thinking that, well, we'll just kind of not, like, I guess, externalize this so much that the community isn't as engaged as they could be in providing local input and really having stakeholders engaged. So really taking ownership, no matter who's producing the actual document, but encouraging you to take ownership as a community of this is your document and you are driving the priorities for what you want to see come out of it.
Yeah, and there's a good distinction there that it is a community plan. It's not necessarily going to be adopted into, like a county general safety plan or a, local hazard mitigation plan. Like it is specific to the community and can be as small as a specific community. It can be as big as a watershed, as big as a county. And it really, you can scale up or down depending on, where your priorities are and what kind of collaboration and, who your stakeholders are. So.
I think the other misstep is not having an actionable items at the end of the CWPP with assigned responsibilities and timelines. Otherwise, the CWPP ends up being a document that sits on the shelf and collects dust.
Yeah, and I'll second that with Kelly. If there isn't a priority, a prioritization of, the action plan and like how to take action, then it'll do the same thing. It'll sit on the shelf. And, we also, one of the reasons that we are listing these requirements is because a lot of those things that we're listing as part of the process and as part of the content of a plan is because those have been failure points, or not failure, but, lacking in some plans in the past. I think what you'll find is that the majority of current CWPPs already incorporate all of those requirements that we've listed off. And, our intent is to make things consistent so that if you are going to pick up a CWPP in the state of California over the next 20 years, you're going to find that they're all going to have some of the same content.
Thanks, everybody. I think just due to interest in time, we're going to probably wrap up here. But I do want to thank everybody for being here in attendance. We're going to do a little bit of toolkit follow-up. I don't know if, Chris, you want to share some more about that.
Oh, sure. Yep, we do have the email pre-fire planning at fire.ca.gov, which you can utilize to ask questions. If there's some burning question that you didn't get answered, feel free to use that email. It comes to me and my team. The webinar is being recorded, and we will post that on the CWPP Toolkit website that's found on the Office of the State Fire Marshal website. And we're going to compile a list of some of the most frequently asked questions, some of which kind of came out of today, and we will post that there as well. You can see the link to where the CWPP Toolkit lives right now.
Thanks, Chris. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and panel speakers during today's webinar, and a sincere thank you to all of you in attendance. We really appreciate your time spent learning more about the California CWPP Toolkit. And apologies that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. We will do our best to keep track of those and use them to inform the frequently asked questions for the toolkit on the website. After leaving this webinar, you'll see a brief evaluation pop up in your browser. So thank you in advance for providing some feedback so we can make sure to continue offering you some high quality content in the future. So a big thanks to everyone again, and please have a wonderful rest of your day.